Well, I think it's the top of the hour, so we can go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day and welcome to our session on trauma-informed care. We're very excited to have Sarah and Shafiqullah here to talk about their work with refugees and what they're facing with the trauma of that situation. Before we get started, I just want to mention a couple of things. First of all, if you have questions during the session, please post them in the Q&A. We will probably wait until the end of the session because there's a lot of material to cover to go through the questions. The chat is also enabled and you are welcome to post in the chat. My colleague Echo Salisbury, who's here with me, and I will be monitoring those. And we are excited to begin. Before we do, I want to launch a poll just so that we and the presenters can see who's here today. If you could just indicate, I see we have a lot of instructional specialists, some program administrators, instructors, intake assessment specialists, and also transition specialists and career coaches. Give it one more minute. Okay, well, it looks like most of you are instructional staff, so 40% instructors, and we also have about 19% instructional specialists or lead instructors. Thanks so much, everybody. I'm going to end the poll. Just to let you know, the content or opinions expressed in the presentation don't necessarily reflect or present the views, positions, or policies of the Maryland Department of Labor, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial products, or organizations imply an official endorsement by the Maryland Department of Labor. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over now to our presenters, and you may go ahead and introduce yourselves and begin.
Thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Sarah Nagy. I am one of the program officers for Preferred Communities at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. And I'll let my colleague Shafiqullah introduce himself very quickly before we head into the presentation.
Thanks, Sarah. My name is Shafiqullah Attayee. I'm also one of the program officers for Prepared Communities, LIRAs, with a focus on UHP.
Thank you. So okay, so before I get it started, I don't know how many of you are familiar with LIRS or why we're having this conversation to begin with. So I'll just give you a little bit of background about our organization and our program, which is Preferred Communities. So Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services is dedicated to serving vulnerable immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees in the United States. They were established in 1939, one of 9 national resettlement agencies. They've resettled over 500,000 refugees and immigrants and welcomed over 11,000 Afghan neighbors. And then the Preferred Communities program, which is the program that both Shafiqullah and I work in, supports refugee and ORR eligible populations, which are other immigrant populations with challenging needs that require special attention. So these are refugees, whether they're elderly or might have health needs that need attention, where they need to see a specialist. Oh, I'm sorry, didn't mean to skip ahead like that. But generally it's refugees who might have additional barriers to self-sufficiency and might take a little bit longer and need additional support. So our program, we oversee case workers all across the country who are providing that direct support to refugees. And then the Preferred Communities also oversees the United for Ukraine program, which has helped with the resettlement of Ukrainians who've come into the country under humanitarian parole. So I know we're talking about trauma-informed care today, and that's a word that's you tend to hear a lot, but sort of understanding what it means when people are using the word trauma-informed care. So using the definition that's provided by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, trauma-informed care incorporates the elements of realizing the prevalence of trauma, recognizing how trauma affects all individuals in a program, organization, or system, and responding by putting this knowledge into practice. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is giving a lot of some background information, different ways that people arrive and different statuses people come into, is like refugees, asylees, what all of those different terms mean in terms of a person's journey to the United States, and then some background information on particularly on Afghanistan and Ukraine, as both of those situations are a lot more sudden than what we're used to seeing come through. And so just giving some additional context to those two conflicts. And then a lot of times when you're talking about trauma, you will also hear this term that's called social determinants of health. So the social determinants of health are generally conditions that you live in and that you work in that affect your overall health outcomes. So the 5 areas of social determinants of health are education, access, and quality, healthcare and quality, neighborhood and built environment, social and community context, and economic stability. So a lot of times when people are talking about trauma-informed care, they're also talking about these social determinants of health. A lot of these aspects, when you're a refugee or you're displaced, they get disrupted. So this is sort of the framework for how we're going to be sort of talking about the different situations and the context of refugee resettlement. So first, just doing a brief kind of overview of the different terms. A refugee is somebody who flees the country due to a fear of persecution. So that might be on the basis of race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. So in order to, the first thing is to be able to even come to the country as a refugee, you have to come from a situation where there is a very clear fear of being persecuted for one of these 5 categories. And then in the refugee process, they're generally starting in a second country and applying for approval to the United States, to come to the United States. So they're approved to make it into the United States before they actually arrive. An asylee, which is another status, an asylee is somebody who is in the United States, but like a refugee, they're unable to return to their country because of a fear of being persecuted in their country. So that's also on the basis of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion. So the distinction between refugee and asylee, I think, is important, is that refugees have already left their country, they're in a second country, and they have nowhere to go, and they apply. They might be in refugee camps. You know, there's a long process of being approved before you ever arrive in the United States. And asylees asking, as originally an asylum seeker, but they're asking for protection once they are in the United States, and then are later granted asylee status. And then an SIV is a special immigrant visa. This is specific to people in Iraq and Afghanistan. The special immigrant visa is available to people who helped out with the United States government as like interpreters or translators in the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. So in order to be eligible for SIV status, you have to have helped the United States government and are promised a pathway into the United States through that help. So in the past, that's been interrupted, and individuals who are eligible for SIV status are often targets in their home countries because of the support that they've provided to the United States, and they're at risk of being targeted. So when we're talking about trauma and PTSD, generally it's the evacuation that is like the time that is the most traumatic. So it's thinking about what situations made people leave their countries, or how they left their country, how long it took to leave the country. So the pictures that are shown in this PowerPoint, that's the airport in Afghanistan during the evacuation, where people in August of 2021. And then this is everybody sort of piling onto the trains in Ukraine last year in February 2022, when the Russian invasion began. I had one of my students who is from Ukraine. I remember she was telling me that she wasn't sure that she would have survived if she hadn't had such small luggage, because she doesn't think she would have made it on the train if she didn't have, you know, her tiny piece of luggage. So I think just the consideration for people weren't expecting to leave, and then they had to leave very quickly and make the decision, you know, not to be able to bring their belongings, or it's just a very difficult period of time. And then what is humanitarian parole? Humanitarian parole, and this is something that you'll hear with both Afghans and Ukrainians, it's an entry that's granted to non-citizens due to a compelling emergency or urgent humanitarian reasons who would otherwise be ineligible for admission into the United States. So as I mentioned before, like the refugee process takes many years to be approved. There's a lot of different like processes that you go through, and everything is just takes a lot of time. So humanitarian parole is a way that they found to sort of fast track, like, you know, helping both the Afghan and Ukrainian populations to be able to come into the United States, but they're not given any kind of immigration status. It's just a way to allow them to temporarily live in the United States without fear of being deported. So in order to stay in the United States, they'll have to either reapply for another term for humanitarian parole before their current term expires, select a different legal status, like if they're eligible for asylum, applying for asylum, or leave the United States. And then I think this is important. So refugees are, you know, granted for 7 years, they can access different, you know, they can access social services they might need. They can access different things to connect. Asylees can as well, but generally it takes many years after being in the United States to be eligible for, or to be approved for asylum. So when they're asylum seekers, they're not able to access any kind of public benefits that would be granted to refugees. And then humanitarian parole, there have been exceptions that have been made in terms of accessing public benefits, but there's no kind of permanency, and they will be at some point. There's an expectation that they'll be returning to their country. And so a lot of times, even though there's these different terms, we might use refugees as kind of a blanket term, but to describe these different populations. But I think it's important to understand the nuance between the different terms. So health concerns and risk factors among all of the populations that we're discussing are this like forced displacement, extensive traumatic experiences in their home countries, lack of access to primary and dental health care, limited basic health and education services, and then interrupted schooling and education for youth. especially for populations you see that are in refugee camps. There may be like several years where there are children who haven't been in school and their education is disrupted. And then I think, you know, the loss of everything that you've left behind is always, you know, a really big stressor among different displaced populations. Mental health, I think a lot of people are worried about their families they've left behind, the trauma of what they've already experienced that, you know, gave them the decision to leave. Stress, especially language stressors. You may have had like a very high profile job as like a doctor in your home country, but because you don't speak English, or maybe your education doesn't transfer over, isn't, you know, acceptable like for the American standards for the same position, you have to sort of have a lower level job where you're making minimum wage because of those language factors. So, and then with that comes the financial instability and the uncertainty. And then with Afghans and Ukrainians especially, that sudden evacuation meant that they had no kind of orientation prior to coming to the United States or time to mentally prepare. It was a very fast decision to, you know, ensure safety, and there was no process for sort of understanding what they might encounter when they come to the United States. I'm going to pass it to Shafiqullah to speak on Afghanistan specifically. Shafiqullah was he evacuated in 2021 and was also served as a caseworker for Afghans in Northern Virginia. So have him speak about Afghanistan and also sort of his experiences in resettlement.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hi again, everyone. I'm very glad and honored to be speaking with you about Afghanistan refugee crisis and understanding of the evacuation a little bit today. But before I proceed with my presentation, to make it more engaging in a two-side communication, I would like to start with a question. If if you have heard anything about Afghanistan, and if yes, what was the first image that comes to your mind? I would like to see some of your answers in the chat box, and then I can proceed with the presentation. I still don't see anything. Is there? Yeah. Yeah, my question is that if our participants have heard anything about Afghanistan, and if the answer is yes, what is the first image that comes to your mind? Yeah, mountain. 75% of Afghanistan is mountain. Very correct. I'd like to see some more answers. Diversity, very correct. Long history, yeah, more than 5,000 years. That's correct. Living France and oh, and Air Force, the things. Thank you. Very diverse and including to evacuation, a lot of things from people trying to get in. Yeah, I have actually a picture of that Sam, like trying to hang out on the wing of the plane and flee out of the country. I'll get through that. Thank you very much for your answer. So it seems that you're all very educated about it and know a lot of things. So I'm going to start with my presentation. Sarah, can you please move to the next page? Mhm. So unfortunately, you probably know about the civil war and internal conflicts in Afghanistan too. So as a result of that, as a result of the 4 decades of civil war and conflicts, there's been a slew of Afghan immigrants all over the world, and also IDPs, internal displaced people within the country inside Afghanistan. According to the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, more than 6 million Afghans were forcibly displaced by end of 2021, either inside the country or to other countries, but mainly there are two neighbors generally hosting like more than the half of the Afghan refugee population. And then, so from that 6 million, the 3.5 million is as I said, there are IDPs internally displaced from one province to another, and 2.6 million Afghans have been hosted as refugees in other countries, accounting it for one of the large refugee crises in the world. Yes, so why people have been fleeing or why they are forced to flee from Afghanistan, as one of you pointed out in the chat about this image. So you probably see the hunger and the thirst of people to find a chance, even if it does very little, to get out of that country. So the first reason is insecurity, unfortunately, which includes like the civil war, the international activity of international terrorist groups inside Afghanistan, interference of some neighboring countries, and beside that, the chronic poverty, which also generates, which is also linked to insecurity, which during this 4 decades of war, any government, any person in power couldn't manage well the economy. As a result, the people have been living all their life in poverty, and they've always been searching anywhere to move out of that country, or to move from rural areas, from areas where they can find a job, to the big cities to have a better life and feed their family. But after the COVID, when the pandemic started, the situation even got worse, unfortunately. So even before the pandemic, more than half of the population were unemployed. So when the pandemic started, many people lost their jobs. And in addition to those other unemployed, now those people who lost employment have been also searching for any ways to get out of that country. And the other issue is that the natural disaster, unfortunately, it's a maintenance country that's good, but due to that, there's a lot of snow in winter in Afghanistan because it's mountainous and cold in winter. And when it gets hotter in the summer, so there are a lot of floods in most of the provinces. And as a result of that, there are a lot of internally displaced people or persons. They have to move from one place to another to save their lives from floods and natural disasters. One of the other main and very important reasons have been the constant change of government and authorities. Like there have been like change in the government every each 5 years or 10 years. And it's not only the person who is going and coming, it's like the change of everything, the change of the system, from changing from communism to democratic, from democratic to like mujahideen, very dictatorship kind of the government. So that has been another big reason that many people wanted to leave the country. So it is very different from other countries who are seeking refuge or asylum to other countries, including the United States, because they like people from Ukraine, Venezuela, they've been like experiencing the trauma, experiencing the stress and mental health, anything like for a year or two. But unfortunately for the Afghans, the story is very different. So they have been experienced this trauma for their whole life, and 4 decades of life for most of the people, most of the generations are young. So as a result, this event, the change of the government and the takeover by the Taliban in August 2021 made the situation even worse and intensified the instability and violence in Afghanistan, which caused even more human suffering and displacement inside the country and all over the world, including the United States. Where Afghans are fleeing to. So according to the UNHCR, Iran and Pakistan, as I mentioned before, have been the main target countries for Afghans. It's close and easy for them. So the statistics by UNHCR are showing the official registered refugees of Afghanistan to the other countries, but the actual number is very, very high. Like even sometimes Pakistan is claiming to hosting like 4 million and Iran the same number. So but people, their main target countries are the European countries, the United States, if they can, but otherwise everyone according to the capabilities and the financial capabilities they have, they're trying to make a target for themselves. But if they cannot go further, they're choosing to go, even if it's not legally, without passport or without visa, anything, they're moving to Iran and Pakistan. And for some people who don't have that kind of capabilities or financial capabilities to move outside the country, so they're moving from one province to another to flee the persecution of the governments, or to kind of overcome the poverty, to get a job in another province or in the big cities. Evacuees to the United States, when the Taliban took over the government on the August 15, 2021. So the United States made one of the big evacuation of its allies from Afghanistan, which according to statistics, more than 75,000 Afghans have been evacuated from Afghanistan. And the big states and cities which has been hosting many Afghans are told to be Texas, Virginia, and California. I lost the track, so we're back. Yeah, we are done with this person. If you could please move to the, yeah. So even after fleeing Afghanistan and finding another country to live, like the United States or the European countries, they're still being dealing with mental health issues, with stress, financial instability, cultural shocks, language barrier, employment, as Sarah also mentioned about it. So many of them who've been working like good jobs or in the government or international organizations, once they're here, due to the language barriers, they cannot get the same jobs as they used to have in Afghanistan, and they're having a lot of stress and disappointment. So now they have to start from zero and start from labor works and other basic jobs. And the cultural shock, like many of them who haven't been outside the country and have lived in a rural part of the country, once they arrive in big cities in the United States, they are culturally shocked and doesn't know anything about how to live here. So it takes some time for them to learn everything and get rid of this stress and mental health. Financial instability is the other thing, like when the lose of everything overnight, the government collapsed, and everyone who made it to the airport, even a week before the collapse, no one had access to their bank accounts. They were like crowded, the banks were closed. So no one was able even to get their savings while departing to the other countries or being evacuated. So that has been another big reason for the stress and trauma for many Afghans here or in other countries. Thanks, Sarah. as one of the participants pointed out about the diversity, yeah, that's very true. The ethnic diversity in Afghanistan is good. There are many tribes and ethnicities. They used to live very peacefully before, like there was not a lot of these boundaries and names and ethnicity issues before, but after this civil war and the interruption from some neighboring countries, unfortunately, supporting specific groups, the gaps has been pulled lately, unfortunately, and there has been some borders and lines between the ethnicities. So this diversity kind of been negatively impacting the population, unfortunately. But there are the like Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, Turkmen, Baluch, and some other minorities living in Afghanistan. We also have like language diversity in Afghanistan. Many languages are spoken there, but the two main and the majority of people speaks Dari and Pashto, Uzbeki, and also Turkmen, Baluchi, Pashtun, as is spoken in some rural parts of the country too. And that's it. Thank you very much, everyone, and I'll be glad to answer your questions at the end of our presentation. Over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you all. We have a document that we're going to share that with the timeline of everything that's been happening in Ukraine. I don't think there's enough time in the presentation today to go over the full context of why what's happening in Ukraine is happening now. But I think that timeline will be a helpful guide if, for your reference to sort of have an understanding of what's happening in Ukraine. So for this presentation, we'll sort of hit on some of those main points of what's going on. Hold on, just trying to get it. So for many Ukrainians, the war has been going on since 2014. In this first image, you'll see these are areas that were annexed by Russia in 2014. So in late 2013, like November of 2013 to 2014, there was a series of protests. The Maidan protest. Maidan is the name of a square in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, and they were protesting the decision of the Ukrainian government at the time to abandon the EU in favor of more friendly relationships with Russia. And the president at that time, Viktor Yanukovych, was very pro-Russian. It's all covered in the timeline, but he ended up abdicating and fleeing for Russia in February of 2014. And when he left, Russia used the context of what was happening to say that they were protecting Russian interests in Ukraine, and came in and took over large swaths of Ukraine that were very, at the time, very friendly towards Russia. So that was Crimea, Donetsk. They'd made it as far down as Mariupol. So those areas that are in red right in this first photo are the areas that had come under attack in 2014 and have sort of been ongoing since then. And then the area that you'll see in the second photo for 2022, that's the area that is controlled currently by Russia and is occupied by Russia. So the question of, I think, language comes up a lot with Ukrainians, especially in terms of like what languages do Ukrainians speak? Do they speak Russian? Do they speak Ukrainian? Why have the names changed? Why are we calling it Kyiv now and not Kiev? I think a lot of Americans would call it the Ukraine, and now why, why people are upset with the term the Ukraine versus Ukraine. So Kyiv is the Ukrainian pronunciation of the capital, while Kiev is the Russian pronunciation. So by calling it Kyiv instead of Kiev, you're recognizing that it belongs to Ukraine, that it's not under Russian influence. And the same with calling it Ukraine versus the Ukraine. So they're in both Ukrainian and Russian, they don't have articles in their language, so you don't have the words a and the. But when you call it the Ukraine in English, it implies that it's the Russian territory of Ukraine. And so that's why people really don't like the use of putting the in front of Ukraine and just calling it Ukraine. So lots of, I served in Ukraine as a Peace Corps volunteer from 2010 to 2012. So this is personal to me because of my personal background, and the town that I lived in is currently occupied by Russians. So when I was there, there were still like a lot of Lenin statues that were all over the country. There was a lot of reverence for the Soviet past. But as Russia started to occupy different areas of Ukraine, all those Lenin statues came down. And I don't believe that there's probably any left, or very few left in the country now. So the Lenin statues were all knocked down, and they put Shevchenko statues up in the place of where the Lenin statues formerly were. So Taras Shevchenko is a very famous Ukrainian poet, and the Lenin statues in 2014 were torn down in favor of the Shevchenko statues that came up in its place. But you'll see that there's a lot of areas of Ukraine that were ethnically Russian under this map. So where you've got the yellow and the brown stripes, that was a significant ethnic Russian population. Crimea was an ethnic Russian majority. And up until where, like in the red, you'll see that's mostly Ukrainian speaking. The pink is predominantly Ukrainian speaking. So it's a mix. And I would say that Ukrainian has always been the national language of Ukraine, and that's what was used in the schools, and that was what was used for curriculum. But depending on where you were in the country previously, people might be have a preference for either speaking Ukrainian or Russian. I think now, because of the events that have happened in the past 8 years, you see a lot of people who are making conscious decisions to switch to Ukrainian because of the implications of everything that Russia's done and taken away. So where there were regions that were almost exclusively Russian before, you have a lot of people who are making conscious decisions to speak Ukrainian, but most people would be able to understand both languages. So I think that's, I didn't know how much time we would have in terms of being able to talk about the country. So that's why the timeline, I think, is something that's really important to consider, that was shared. In 2000, a lot of what you'll see if you look at that timeline starts in 2004. And that was with the Orange Revolution. So that was also a series of protests about whether Ukraine would sort of go more towards the European Union or be friendlier to Russia. And Yanukovych, who later did become president in 2010, he was the one who was accused of rigging the vote that kind of led to the protests that happened in the Orange Revolution. And he was very friendly towards Russia. He ended up, when he did become president in 2010, he ended up jailing his political opponents. And so there's a lot of layers, but I think even for that period of time, even the politicians who were very pro-Western, there was a lot of corruption in place. So there was never a clear side that really, I don't think Ukrainians ever felt like their interests were ever like cared for by either side. But because of because of in 2014 when Russia did come in, there were many people who had favorable decisions to Russia coming in, but because of that sort of stilted war, there's not much favorable Russian sentiment like there had been in 2014 when they first started taking over. So when we are talking about Afghanistan and Ukraine, I think we talk about those social determinants of health that we referenced in the beginning of the presentation. You can see, because there's a lot of community, you have elderly people who always sort of identified with, the Soviet history, and we're very proud of their Soviet history. And and now you sort of have to reckon with the fact that those, that's who's attacking you. I think it's a very difficult thing when what you sort of consider as a part of your identity for a long time is sort of challenged because that country is invading. So and then having to leave very suddenly. But I think one of the things that's really special about working with refugees and all of the immigrant populations that we work with is that they are so resilient. They're so they're not, people aren't living by the trauma that has existed. You're not sort of doomed to have, a terrible life just because you've had these really bad things happen to you. And you talk about the social determinants of health, and it's like, why do some people are able to more easily overcome the circumstances of what's happened to them versus, and some people have a lot more challenges in terms of sort of overcoming that. And so that's where you talk about resilience factors, and that's being connected to your family or your community, your teachers. So anyone who's sort of, able to come in and provide that supportive environment helps you build those resilience factors. So, reestablishing norms and where they've been disrupted and creating that social cohesion, like all of that is very important to sort of creating that order where it's been lost or where it's been disrupted. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, and the refugees, they have such an enormous capacity for resilience. The fact that they've kind of come over all this bureaucratic red tape and they're here in the United States, I mean, that already sort of says so much. They've defied so many odds to make it here. So, and I think it's important because we do always talk about mental health with refugees. And I think sometimes because of our own stigmas and stuff, we equate mental health with like mental illness, and they're not mutually exclusive. They're not the same thing. I think, but it's recognizing that, people are worried about their families back home. They have their stresses. They don't really know what the future is going to hold, especially with these like humanitarian parolee statuses. They don't know whether they're going to be able to find some sort of permanency to be in the United States permanently, or if it's, they'll have to go back, to Ukraine. And if they do, like their homes have been destroyed. And for Afghans too, it's just sort of like trying to navigate all of those situations in a very new country and supporting your family. But what we can do, hold on. I think just being present for people, and listening. I said don't jump to conclusions, because I think sometimes people get very upset with us. There's a lot of things that people are stressed out about, and sometimes you're the safe person that they might feel comfortable unloading on, and that's not a fair position to be in. to be the person who sort of is the recipient of all that stress. But I think maybe sometimes understanding, like, are they yelling at you, or are they, are they frustrated because, this is just a series of the next thing that sort of happened. And so really, trying to determine, like, what's the cause of anger, if somebody's angry at you, or, is it, did something happen in their, town back at home and they're really worried about it and it's manifesting in this different way. I think enhancing social connections, one of the things I think that your programs do very well, and when you have volunteers or have different groups that are coming in to help people find transportation, for their English classes or for work or whatever they're doing, really connecting to those new systems and programs here in the United States is just an immense benefit. It, like, having that regularity of having the classes, that's establishing some sort of routine back into somebody's life. So I think just being that consistent person, and then being equitable. I think, and Shafiq might be able to speak on this a little more in his thing, but I think, a lot of times if you see somebody who's getting some sort of benefit, like maybe they're offered a class and I'm not offered that class, and I don't understand the reasons why, I might see that there's favoritism. So just sort of having that comfort to have a dialogue on why things maybe work in a certain way, and that it's not preferential treatment, because sometimes I think it might appear that way, especially with all the different statuses that have sort of affected things now. And just affirming that you're there to work together with them, I think is just a big, tremendous thing. So thank you guys so much for being with us today. I know it's a few minutes before question time, but we can just go ahead and open it up to questions if anybody has any questions.
If you have a question, please post it in the Q&A. I think you answered the one that I saw earlier. Here's a question. This is from Yolanda. What are the key areas where your students are living? I've not come across many through my particular teaching from Ukraine and Afghanistan and Maryland, in Anne Arundel County.
So we don't have particular students that we work. We work with caseworkers who live all across the country, who are so certain areas might see more Ukrainians or Afghans. Like I know Shafiqullah mentioned in his presentation that there's a lot of Afghans in Northern Virginia, for example. I think a lot of this stuff, we focused on Afghanistan and Ukraine because of those are sort of like the crises of the past 2 years that have gotten a lot of attention. I think if a lot of this stuff still applies, I think, with any other kind of refugee population. You do have, especially like the schooling interruption, the language issues, and sort of the stress of not being able to sort of get the type of job you want, or if you're a mother who has a lot of children, where it might have been a little bit easier to navigate in your home country because it was very like the community sort of supported each other. It's a lot more isolated here, and so you're expected to work, and you don't have childcare that's taken care of. I think especially, so I'm reading the comment like as I'm talking, so I see that you have students from Central and South America. I think, yeah, definitely in terms of like the violence, we can reach out to some of our colleagues who might have more context of what's happening in those countries too, and share that out after this presentation. But I think a lot of this is very, I think any kind of situation where you're having to sort of restart in a new country, there's a lot of commonalities.
I think in Maryland, probably the areas that you're going to see more of the refugees will be in the Washington, D.C. metro area, Prince George's, Montgomery County areas, Baltimore metro area. I think Frederick might be another one. So from some preliminary meetings we've had, those seem to be the ones that are identified as probably receiving more of the refugees.
Yeah. I'm reading Eileen's question about feeling guilty, students who feel guilty for being here when their families don't get out of, can't get out of bad situations, and how to reassure them. I think the more that you can establish trust, and sometimes it's just a matter of listening because we don't have helpful things to say, but you know, people need a safe space to sort of process these things, is important. If there's avenues to sort of reframe the conversation about, you know, about their safety and sort of what they might be able to do for their family here. One of the things that I know that was always a struggle when I was a caseworker is when you talk to families about budgeting, because they would always send money back to their families who are, you know, back home. And so savings is always a challenging conversation because their family had so much immediate need for the money. And it's like, how do you tell a person not to send their money back to their family who's at high risk? So there's not necessarily good answers for some of these questions, but the more you can sort of be present and listen, I think people just really appreciate having a person that they can sort of process a lot of these things with. Shafiqullah, I want to pass it to you in the question, if you can speak about your experiences when you first came and needs that you wish maybe were met that weren't, or your, you know, observations as a caseworker.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That's a good question. So first, when I arrived, as I probably explained during my presentation, so we weren't ready for such a move from Afghanistan to here. Though I was in the pipeline from my assignment, but I didn't expect it that soon. So it was a sudden evacuation, and I didn't know anything, to be honest, about a lot of things. Like one of the things that when I had my interview with the IN, that they asked me, where do you want to go? Since I didn't have any family or here that I could get some advice and information about from them to where could be a good place or which the city, which state that could be good for a refugee, for a family who lost everything and just new in the country and doesn't know a lot. I would like, if someone would give me some good advices or some good information, probably I would make a better decision, because many Afghan families are choosing some very expensive states and cities like Northern Virginia, California. Everything is very expensive, including the housing rent, which is one of the main obstacles for many Afghan refugees nowadays. So if someone could give me a clear information or better information about housing and the cities the refugees could live with a reasonable price and having good job, I think would help a lot many Afghan refugees or even other refugees. So lack of information at the beginning this leads to some wrong decisions or making some wrong decisions. So what I can say is that if there are some cultural orientations when they arrive, whether it's a camp or whether it's even in a third country like Qatar or Islamabad, that they're informed of everything. Once they're in the country, they can take a better decision with to leave and what kind of job to look for. I think would be a good thing for the new arrivals.
We have a couple of things in our Q&A. Jovita just wanted to say this was a powerful presentation. And we have a question from Nicole. What status allows refugees to be able to work?
That's a great question. So if refugees are allowed to work, they need a document that's called the EAD, which is Employment Authorization Document. And sometimes that interrupts how quickly that arrives. Sometimes will be a challenge because everyone is eligible to work, but sometimes the EAD takes a few months to arrive. And so I know that Social Security Administration has recently given guidance to some of the different populations on the EAD, explaining to employers this might take a long time, and this is why, and this is what you can do. So asylees are allowed to work once they've been granted their asylum. Asylum seekers are not able to legally work while they're in the United States. The humanitarian parole status is a little bit tricky. There have been exceptions that have been made for Afghans and Ukrainians to work, but other populations might have that humanitarian parole status, and it might be a little more vague on what the work requirements are. But I would say asylum seekers are probably the most challenged population because they might be in the United States for years waiting to get that asylum status, and they're not able to work. So that's a lot of people who you might see who are coming across the border, and they're not, they may eventually have that asylum status where they can work, but they don't have it. And then for all of the populations, you have to get your citizenship within 7 years to continue to be eligible for different benefits like food stamps or Social Security. All of those run out if you've not become a citizen within 7 years. And that's most challenging for elderly refugees who might really struggle to learn English, and English is very hard, and they have a lot of trouble passing that citizenship test because of the English language skills. And then if they don't get it within that 7 years, they might lose access to benefits. So that's really hard.
We have time for one more quick question, and Judy wants to know what status allows refugees and asylees to receive financial aid for college.
I would assume that it would be I don't know this answer. I don't want to give you an answer and not have all the full information, so I can maybe ask and come back and send the information. I would assume it would be all the same statuses that we've just sort of mentioned. I think if you have a legal path in the United States, there's probably opportunities to be eligible for financial aid, but I don't know that specifically enough to.
So Betsy is saying it's FAFSA unless they're undocumented. I want to thank you to our presenters for a great presentation. We really appreciate your being here today. And to the participants, I'm going to end the webinar in an evaluation will come up right away. So please stay and take the time to fill that out. Again, thanks so much to Sarah and Shafiqullah. We really appreciate you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen.